My name is Ingrid Halvorsen, and I'm 34 years old. I'm standing at the window of a ferry terminal coffee shop, watching the 6:18 a.m. crossing pull away from the dock, and I'm thinking about my father's voice on the phone 3 days ago. The way he said it so quietly. The way he didn't apologize. In my coat pocket there is a small brass boat key on a split ring. I put it there yesterday morning and I haven't moved it since. I'm not sure yet what I'm going to do with it. The terminal smells like diesel and burnt coffee and the particular wet wool dampness that clings to everything in November on this stretch of the Washington coast. I've been coming to this terminal since I was 7 years old, when my father used to bring me down to watch the boats. He'd lift me onto the dock railing and hold my waist and tell me the names of every vessel in the harbor. He said knowing the names of things was how you respected them. I thought about that when he called. He said, "Ingrid, I've been thinking about the wedding." I said, "Okay." He said, "Your sister feels that if I walk you down the aisle it might be difficult for her. Given everything." I asked what everything meant. He didn't answer that. He said, "Your mother and I talked about it, and we think it would be better if you just walked alone. It's not a big deal. Lots of women do it." I said nothing. He said, "You understand, right? It's just one moment. The rest of the day is still yours." I kept my voice even. I said, "I understand." I hung up and stood in my kitchen for a long time. Rain on the windows. The ferry horn sounding once across the water. I didn't cry. I stood there and thought about the names of things and about who had taught me to care about them. There is a particular quality to the silence that follows a conversation like that. It is not the absence of sound. There was rain, there was the harbor, there was the refrigerator's hum and the tick of the heat turning on in the pipes. It is more like the absence of the version of things you had been holding. My father was going to walk me down the aisle. That version was over. What remained was the fact of it. 3 days, a venue booked and paid for, 200 people with travel arrangements made, a dress hanging in a garment bag in the corner of our bedroom. All of that was still real. Only the thing at the center of it had changed. I stood there until I was sure I knew what I wanted to do next. Then I went to bed. Matthias was still awake. I told him plainly, the same way I would later tell Eric. He held my hand across the kitchen table and did not try to fix it or expand it into something larger than it was. I had known from very early on that this was one of the specific ways he loved me. He didn't go looking for the drama in things. He stayed with what was there. My sister's name is Britta. She is 31 and has been married for 4 years to a man named Cole who sells insurance and coaches recreational soccer on weekends. Their wedding was in June at a vineyard east of the mountains. My father walked her down the aisle in a gray suit with a yellow rose in the lapel. He cried. I stood in the front row and watched him cry, and I was glad for her. I was genuinely glad. Britta had not spoken to me directly in 14 months. The reason for that silence was something I had watched build over years, layer by layer, the way silt builds at the mouth of a harbor. I had not caused it. But I had refused to pretend it wasn't there, and in our family that refusal was treated as the greater offense. My name is Ingrid Halvorsen, and I grew up in a harbor town 40 minutes north of Olympia, in a house that smelled like wood smoke and low tide. My father was a marine contractor. My mother kept the books for his company and raised us and made everything look easier than it was. It was a good childhood in the ways that count. I don't say otherwise. But I learned early that in our family peace was purchased. And the currency was silence. I am a structural engineer. I have been one for 9 years, licensed in Washington and Oregon, and for the last 6 I have worked for a mid-sized firm in Olympia that specializes in marine infrastructure. Docks, breakwaters, boat launch facilities, harbor rehabilitation projects. I know the coast I grew up on from a different angle now. I know which pilings are original and which were replaced after the '01 storm. I know where the substrate is soft and where it holds. I met my husband Matthias at a marine trade dinner in Tacoma 5 years ago. He was there representing a fabrication company that supplied the hardware for a bulkhead project my firm had designed. He asked me 2 intelligent questions about load-bearing specifications and 1 completely disarming question about whether I actually liked this work or just happened to be good at it. I told him both were true. He said that was the right answer. Matthias is 37. He is tall and quieter than he looks like he should be, and he has the particular patience of someone who grew up around boats, comfortable with weather, comfortable with waiting, not easily rattled. His family is from the Bellingham area. His father, Gunnar, ran a boatyard for 30 years before his knees gave out. His mother, Sonia, volunteers at the Maritime Museum and grows dahlias in a garden that she treats with professional seriousness. They are kind people. I want to say that plainly because it matters to the story. When Matthias proposed 18 months ago, he did it on the dock behind his parents' boatyard at 7:23 p.m. on a Tuesday in September, when the light was going orange off the water and the smell of salt and engine oil was everywhere. He had his grandfather's ring. It had belonged to a man who came over from Norway in 1952 with $17 and a set of hand tools, and who built enough of a life in the Pacific Northwest that his grandson could stand on a dock in the last of the September light and offer it to someone he loved. I said yes immediately. I didn't make him wait. We set the date for the following November. The venue was a restored boathouse on the edge of a small harbor town south of Bellingham. Matthias's territory, his family's landscape, a place that smelled like cedar and brine and old rope. I had been there twice before the booking and loved it both times. The ceremony would be inside, in the main hall with the old timber framing and the high clear-story windows. The reception would spill out onto the dock. My family knew about the wedding from the beginning. My mother had been to the venue in July and called it beautiful. My father had shaken Matthias's hand at a family dinner in August and told him he was glad to have him. Britta had RSVP'd yes with Cole back in May, before the silence between us calcified into something with weight and permanence. None of that prepared me for the phone call 3 days out. I had asked my father formally in a card I mailed in September if he would walk me down the aisle. I wrote it by hand. I said it would mean something to me. He called 2 days after receiving it and said yes without hesitation. He said he was honored. That was 8 weeks before he called back to say he had changed his mind. What Britta felt about the prospect of our father walking me down the aisle, I was not told directly. I heard it secondhand from my mother in a separate call the evening after my father's. My mother said Britta had expressed that it would be hard for her to watch. She did not explain further. My mother said, "You know how she is right now." As if that explained something. As if I was supposed to absorb the cost of how Britta was right now, the way I had absorbed every other cost in the years leading up to this one. I said, "I understand, Mom." I didn't say anything else. I let the silence hold. The anchor object came to me the next morning. I was in the spare room of our apartment, the one I use as a home office, going through a box of things I'd moved from my childhood bedroom when my parents downsized 3 years ago. I found it near the bottom of the box, wrapped in a piece of newspaper that had gone soft at the edges, a small brass boat key on a split ring attached to a square of cork. My father had given it to me when I was 12, the first summer he let me take the runabout out alone. He said every person who operated a vessel needed to be responsible for her own key. He said losing it was not an option. I had kept it for 22 years. I set it on my desk and looked at it for a long time. There are things you hold on to because you believe the person who gave them to you still means what they meant when they gave it. And there are things you hold on to because you can't yet face what it means that they don't. I put the key in my coat pocket. I didn't know yet what I was going to do with it. I just knew I wasn't leaving it behind. The labor of the previous 3 years is not easy to account for in a single telling, but I will try to be specific because the specifics are what I have. In the winter 2 years before the wedding, my father's company hit a rough stretch. A municipal contract he'd counted on fell through when the city council restructured the harbor development budget. He was short on operating capital and too proud to go to a bank. I found out through my mother, not through him. A phone call on a Tuesday evening where she mentioned it almost in passing, as though it were a small thing, as though I wouldn't notice the weight underneath it. I transferred $22,000 from my savings account to their joint account on a Thursday morning before work. I sent my mother a text that said only, "For the operating shortfall. Don't make it a conversation." She didn't. My father thanked me once briefly at Christmas dinner that year. He said, "That was good of you." Then he changed the subject. That same winter, Britta and Cole were trying to buy their first house. The market in their area was difficult and their down payment was short. My parents couldn't help, they were still stabilizing after the contract loss. I co-signed a short-term personal loan that bridged the gap. The amount was $18,500. I was on the hook if they defaulted. I understood that clearly when I signed. I read the loan documents at my kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon and then signed and sent them back. They didn't default. Britta did not thank me. She acknowledged the loan once, in a group text, with a thumbs-up emoji. The following spring, my mother had a procedure. Minor, outpatient, no drama, but she needed 2 weeks of reduced activity afterward. Matthias and I drove up on a Friday night 4 hours round trip and stayed through Sunday. I cooked meals that could be frozen in portions. Soups, a chicken and rice dish, 2 separate casseroles, labeled and stacked in their chest freezer in the garage. I reorganized their kitchen pantry because my mother had mentioned twice that it frustrated her. I cleaned the gutters while Matthias helped my father pressure wash the back deck. We drove home Sunday evening. My mother sent a card that arrived the following Thursday. My father sent nothing, which was not unusual. He showed appreciation in other ways, or he used to. That summer, my father had a contract dispute with a subcontractor on a dock rehabilitation project near the harbor where I grew up. The subcontractor was threatening to file a lien. My father didn't understand the specifics of the lien process and was anxious about it in the way he got anxious about things he couldn't fix with his hands, quietly and with a kind of restlessness that made everyone around him careful. I spent 3 evenings after work reviewing the contract documents he scanned and sent me. I wrote him a plain language summary of his position, identified the 2 clauses that protected him, and drafted a response letter he could send through his attorney. The dispute was resolved without litigation. He told me I had saved him a significant headache. He said it the way someone says it when they mean it and also don't want to dwell on owing someone something. Britta's silence toward me began hardening that fall, after an incident at a family gathering that I will not narrate in full because it is not the center of this story. What I will say is that I declined to agree with a version of events that was not accurate. In our family, that refusal was treated as the greater injury. My mother called me the following week and said, "Can't you just let her have this one?" I said she can have whatever she wants. I'm not going to say something that isn't true. My mother said, "You've always been so rigid." She said it gently, the way she said most difficult things, wrapped in softness so it arrived without a clear edge to push back against. I said, "I know." I didn't argue. That was the last substantive conversation my mother and I had about Britta for 7 months. What followed was not dramatic. No confrontations, no ultimatums. Britta and I simply ceased to be in direct contact, and the family adjusted around the absence the way families do, routing conversations through other people, avoiding certain topics at dinners, developing a collective politeness about the shape of what was not being said. I went to Christmas. I helped with what needed helping with. I called my mother on her birthday and my father on his. The silence with Britta sat in the middle of the family like a piece of furniture that everyone had agreed not to mention and had also agreed not to move. I was fine with it. I was not fine with it. Both of those things were true, and I held them without resolving them, which is what you do when the alternative is worse. In the following spring, I helped my parents with their taxes when their accountant retired abruptly, and they couldn't find a replacement before the deadline. I am not a tax professional, but I am comfortable with numbers and documentation, and their situation was not complicated. I drove up on a Saturday, spent 6 hours going through their records at the kitchen table while my mother made coffee and my father worked in the yard. I organized the receipts by category, reconstructed 3 months of records from bank statements that hadn't been reconciled, and filed an extension that gave them time to find proper help. My mother said, "At the end of the day, what would we do without you?" She meant it warmly. I said, "You'd figure it out." She laughed. My father came in from the yard with soil on his hands and said, "You staying for dinner?" I said yes. We had salmon. It was a good evening. The proper help cost them $400. Without the extension, the late penalties would have been significantly more. I said none of this in the months after to anyone. I did not accumulate it consciously. It accumulated the way sediment does, not because of any single action but because of the steady movement of water over time, and because that is the nature of what collects at the bottom of things. That same spring I designed, pro bono in my own time, a structural assessment for a small addition my parents wanted to put on their house. It was a covered porch, nothing elaborate, but it required a permit and a stamped drawing. I prepared the drawing myself, submitted it through my firm's drafting software, and had it stamped by my professional seal. The permit was approved in 6 weeks. The contractor my parents hired told my father it was the cleanest set of drawings he'd worked from in years. My father relayed this to me at a dinner that June. He looked pleased. I said, "Good. I'm glad it was useful." The summer before the wedding, when my mother mentioned that the boat shed behind their property needed a new ramp for the small vessel they used for weekend fishing, I reached out to a marine hardware supplier I worked with professionally and sourced the materials at cost. Matthias and I installed the ramp on a Saturday morning in July. It took 3 hours. The materials would have cost my father twice as much at retail. He brought us coffee while we worked and told a story about the first ramp he ever built, 40 years ago, with 2 friends and a come-along and a plan that was mostly improvised. It was a good morning. I was glad for it. I held on to all of it. Not as grievance, that is not the right word. More the way you hold a folded chart, the kind that shows you where the deep water is and where the ground comes up without warning. You hold it because the information is real and because at some point you may need it. 3 days before my wedding, the ground came up fast. I did not panic. I stood at my kitchen window, listening to the ferry horn across the water, and I thought about a man I had called once, 6 months before, about a completely different matter. A man who had answered the phone on the second ring and said, "Ingrid, what do you need?" I knew what I needed now. My uncle Eric is my father's older brother. He is 67 years old and has lived in the same house on the edge of a harbor town north of Anacortes for 31 years. He built the house himself over 2 summers with help from 3 friends and a structural manual he checked out of the county library. He is a retired maritime surveyor. He was the person I called when I needed to understand a load-bearing question on my first independent project, before I trusted my own instincts entirely. He was the person who drove 4 hours in January ice to help me move into my first apartment because I hadn't told anyone else I was moving, and he found out and came anyway. He did not make a production of either thing. He never did. That was how he was built. I picked up my phone. I called him at 9:14 p.m. He answered on the second ring. I said, "Eric." He said, "Ingrid, what do you need?" I told him. I told him plainly the way I'd learned to tell him things. No softening, no build-up, just the structure of it. My father had called. He was not coming. Britta had expressed a concern. My mother agreed it was better this way. The wedding was in 3 days. Eric was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He called you himself?" I said, "Yes." He said, "And your mother?" I said, "She called after. She said I should walk alone. She said lots of women do it." Another pause. Long enough that I heard the ferry horn in the background of his line, far off across the water. He said, "I'll be there." I said I wasn't calling to ask. He said, "Ingrid, I'll be there. What time do the doors open?" I told him 3 p.m. I told him the venue. I told him I would send the address. He said, "I'll be outside at 2:30. You won't have to look for me." I said, "Thank you." He said, "Don't thank me. Get some sleep." I put the phone down and stood at my window for a while. The rain was steady against the glass. I didn't feel relief exactly. It was something quieter than that, the particular kind of calm that comes when a decision has been made and the making is over. The ferry horn sounded again, further away this time, and I went to bed. The next morning was the rehearsal. The venue was a 40-minute drive north. Matthias drove. We didn't talk much. He knew what had happened. I'd told him the night of my father's call plainly, and he had held my hand across the kitchen table and not tried to fix it or inflate it. That was one of the things I had understood about him early. He didn't reach for words when they weren't useful. He just stayed. We arrived at the venue at 10:47 a.m. The boathouse was gray in the November light, Cedar siding weathered to silver, the harbor behind it flat and pale. The smell when we walked in was cedar and old rope and the particular cold air smell of a building that sits on water. I stood in the main hall and looked at the timber framing and the clear-story windows and thought, this is right. Whatever else happens, this space is right. My parents arrived at 11:23 a.m. I saw my mother first. She came through the side entrance with her coat still buttoned and her expression set to the particular arrangement she used when she was managing something. Warm but preoccupied, smile at the right width, eyes slightly too busy. She hugged me and said the venue was even more beautiful in person and asked if I'd eaten breakfast. My father came in behind her. He looked the way he had looked for the past year or so. A little smaller than I remembered him being, a little more careful in his movements, as though he'd learned to take up less space. He was 63. He hugged me briefly and said, "You look well." I said, "Thanks, Dad." He said, "Everything set?" I said, "Yes." He didn't ask about the aisle. I didn't bring it up. We moved into the rehearsal, and I watched the officiant walk my parents to their seats, watched them settle into the front row on the left side, watched my mother arrange her coat on the chair beside her as though Britta would be sitting there. Britta was not at the rehearsal. She had sent a text that morning saying she and Cole were driving up the morning of the wedding instead. The rehearsal took 40 minutes. The officiant was a woman named Paula who had a calm, direct manner and asked good questions. She asked who would be escorting me down the aisle. I said, "My Uncle Eric." My mother, standing 4 feet away, went very still. My father said nothing. He was looking at the floor. Paula made a note and moved on. The rest of the rehearsal was uneventful. Matthias walked through his part with the quiet composure he brought to everything, and his parents sat in the third row and smiled, and the light through the clear-story windows shifted from gray to pale gold as the clouds thinned, and it was all exactly as I had hoped it would be. After the rehearsal, we gathered in the small anteroom off the main hall, Matthias's family, my parents, the officiant, the venue coordinator. Someone had set out coffee and a plate of pastries. I was standing with Gunnar and Sonia, talking about the harbor, when my mother appeared at my elbow. She said, "Can we talk for a minute?" "Just you and me." I said, "Sure." She steered me toward the far corner of the room. My father stayed near the coffee table. My mother looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "You called Eric?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Ingrid." She said it the way she said my name when she wanted the name itself to do the work of a longer argument. "You know how your father feels about Eric?" I said. Eric said yes. "I'm happy to have him." My mother's jaw tightened slightly. She said, "I understand, but you have to see how this looks. Your father is right here. He's at the rehearsal. He came all this way. Having Eric walk you in, it's a statement." I said, "I'm not trying to make a statement." She said, "It will look like one." I said nothing. She adjusted the strap of her purse. She said, "Your father made a difficult decision. He was trying to keep the peace with Britta. That's not, he wasn't trying to hurt you. He was trying to hold the family together." I kept my voice even. I said, "I know that's how it felt to him." She said, "It's how it was. And now you're bringing Eric in, and your father is going to he's going to feel replaced. On your wedding day. In front of everyone." I said, "He made a choice, Mom." She said, "He made a hard choice. There's a difference." I let the silence hold. My mother looked at her hands. She said, "I just want this day to be good. For everyone. I want you to have a beautiful wedding and I want your father to be part of it. Couldn't you have them both walk you? Eric on one side, your father on the other? Something that doesn't turn this into a moment?" I looked at her. I said, "No." She looked up. I said, "I asked Dad. Formally. I sent a card. He said yes. Then 3 days before the wedding he called and said no because Britta would find it hard to watch. I'm not going to ask him to walk me now because it's convenient or to save the appearance of something. Eric said yes when it counted. My mother said, "Britta is struggling." I said, "I know she is." She said, "She's your sister." I said, "I know who she is." She said, "Then can't you?" I said, "No." The word landed cleanly. Not hard. Just final. My mother's eyes went slightly bright. Not tears, she didn't cry easily, she never had, but the brightness that came before she made a decision about whether to cry. She said, I hope you won't regret this. I said, I hope so too. She looked at me for another moment. Then she went back to the coffee table. I watched her say something quietly to my father. I watched his face arrange itself into something careful and closed. He didn't look at me. I went back to Gunnar and Sonia. Gunnar handed me a cup of coffee. He said, everything all right? I said, yes. Everything's fine. He nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they're choosing to take you at your word. I liked him very much in that moment. We said our goodbyes in the parking area an hour later. My parents were quiet going out. My father held the door for my mother and didn't speak to me beyond a brief nod. I watched them walk to their car. The harbor behind the boathouse was flat and gray, a single cormorant standing at the end of the dock with its wings held open to dry. The air had the particular bite that comes off the water in November when the clouds sit low and the light has no direction. I stood in it until their taillights disappeared around the bend. Matthias put his hand between my shoulder blades. He didn't say anything. I was glad for that. We stopped on the way back for dinner at a place in Anacortes that Matthias knew. A small spot near the ferry dock, the kind that doesn't look like much from outside but smells like garlic and wood smoke when you push through the door. We sat in the back and ate salmon and split a piece of pie and talked about almost nothing of consequence. He told me something funny that his father had said during the rehearsal and I laughed at it, and it felt good to laugh, uncomplicated and without any weight attached to it. I slept well that night. I hadn't expected to. The morning of the wedding arrived at 5:51 a.m. That was when my eyes opened without an alarm. The room was dark and quiet. Matthias was still asleep. I lay still for a while and listened to the rain on the windows, lighter than it had been, barely more than mist, and the distant sound of a ferry horn moving through the dark somewhere out on the water. I got up and went to the kitchen and made coffee and stood at the window the way I always stood at windows in the early morning. The harbor lights were still on. A single vessel was moving slowly toward the dock, its running lights orange in the gray, the water around it flat and black. I watched until it reached the dock and went still. I had my coat on the chair by the door. In the inside pocket was the brass boat key on its square of cork. I had transferred it there from my desk 2 days before and had not moved it since. I didn't have a clear plan for it. I just needed it near me. At 7 a.m. I went to the venue with the hair and makeup team Matthias's mother had organized. The boathouse was dim and quiet at that hour, the main hall smelling of cedar and the faint brine that came through when the tide was moving. I stood at the high windows while someone worked on my hair and watched the harbor come awake. A fishing vessel moving out toward the channel, the dock crew starting their morning, the particular pewter light of a November day settling over everything with the slow confidence of something that has done this before and will do it again. At 8:44 a.m. I was in the bridal anteroom with my dress on, my hair done, a cup of tea I wasn't drinking on the table beside me. The venue coordinator knocked at 9:02 a.m. and said, "Your parents are here." I said, "Thank you." At 10:30 a.m. I heard voices I recognized, Britta and Cole, somewhere down the hall. I did not go out. At 11:47 a.m. my mother knocked. I said, "Come in." She opened the door and came in alone. She was dressed for the wedding, a deep navy coat dress, her good earrings. She looked at me for a moment and her face did something complicated and she said, "You look beautiful." I said, "Thank you." She sat down in the chair across from me. She had her purse on her lap and her hands folded on top of it. She said, "I wanted to come before everything started." I said, "Okay." She said, "I want to say that yesterday she stopped." She started again. "I said some things yesterday that were more about Britta than about you, and that wasn't fair." I said nothing. She said, "Your father he's in a difficult position." I kept my voice even. I said, "I know he is." She said, "He loves you. I want you to know that. He loves you very much." I said, "I know that too." She unfolded her hands and folded them again. She said, "Is there anything that is there any possibility that you'd reconsider?" About Eric? Your father asked me to ask. He didn't want to ask you himself. I looked at her. She said, he's your father. He knows he handled this badly. But he's here. He wants to be part of this. I said, he is part of this. He's sitting in the front row. She said, Ingrid. I said, Mom. I'm not changing the plan. Eric is walking me in. She said, Britta is going to. I said, Britta's response to who walks me down the aisle on my own wedding day is not something I can be responsible for. My mother looked at her hands. She said very quietly, she said she might leave if Eric walks you in. I didn't answer that. She said, I just wanted you to know. I said, I appreciate you telling me. She said, you're not going to change your mind. I said, no. She sat with that for a moment. The room was very quiet. Outside I could hear the sound of guests arriving, low voices, the creak of the old timber floor in the main hall. My mother stood. She smoothed her coat dress. She said, you're so much like your father's side of the family. I said, I know. She looked at me for a moment. Not quite the way she looked at me when she was managing something, but not quite like anything else either. She said, I hope today is everything you want it to be. I mean that. Whatever I said yesterday, I mean this. I said, I know you do. She left. I sat with the quiet for a little while. My throat went tight just briefly and then it loosened. I picked up the tea. It was cold. I drank it anyway. At 12:30 p.m. Britta knocked. I said, come in. She came in alone. She was wearing a dark green dress I hadn't seen before. She looked the way she always looked, composed, carefully put together, a fraction of tension visible only if you knew where to look. She looked at me for a moment and said, you look beautiful. I said, thank you. She didn't sit. She stood near the door with her hands at her sides. She said, Mom told me you talked. I said, we did. She said, I want to say something and I need you to just hear me. I said, okay. She said, I know that you think I'm the reason Dad isn't walking you in. And I understand why you feel that way. But you have to understand how this situation looks from my side. I said nothing. She said, Dad walking you in, with everything that's been between us, it's like the family is taking a side. Publicly. In front of everyone we know. And she stopped. I've spent a long time trying to rebuild my relationship with Mom and Dad, and this felt like, she stopped again. It felt like it was going to set back everything I've worked for. I said, I hear you. She said, I'm not a villain here. I said, I didn't say you were. She said, but you're acting like I am. You're punishing Dad. You're punishing the whole family. Just because I expressed one feeling. I said, you expressed a feeling to Mom and Dad 3 days before my wedding, and Dad called to cancel what he'd already committed to. That's what happened. She said, he was trying to protect me. I said, yes. She said, and you can't understand that? You can't give me one thing? After everything? I kept my voice even. I said, Britta. I gave you the cosign on your house. I gave Dad $22,000 when the contract fell through. I drove up and cooked and cleaned when Mom had her procedure. I've given a lot of things. Her face went still. I said, I'm not asking you for anything today. I'm not asking you to do anything at all. I'm asking you to sit in a chair and watch me get married. She said, you know that's not what this is about. I said, then tell me what it's about. She didn't answer right away. Her jaw tightened. She said, you've always made me feel like less. Like I'm less capable, less accomplished, less. You walk into a room and everyone you don't even try to do it and you still manage to make everyone feel like they're not enough. The room went very quiet. I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence hold. Then I said, that's not something I know how to fix for you. She said, I'm not asking you to fix it. I'm asking you to be my sister for one day. I said, I've been your sister every day. Even the days you didn't speak to me. She looked at me. The color had left her face slightly. She said, if Eric walks you in, I'm leaving. I said, I know. Mom told me. She said, and you're still going to do it. I said, yes. She stood there for a moment longer. Then she said, fine. She said it in the way that meant it was not fine at all, but that she had run out of leverage. She turned and left. She closed the door quietly, which was somehow worse than if she'd slammed it. I sat with the stillness. My throat was not tight anymore. Something else was there instead, not relief, not satisfaction, not anything I could name cleanly. Something that felt more like the moment when you've read a chart long enough that you finally understand where you are and what the water is going to do. I reached into my coat pocket. The brass key was there, warm from the fabric. I held it in my closed hand for a moment. At 1:15 p.m. I put the coat down and smoothed my dress. At 1:40 p.m. the venue coordinator knocked and said guests were seated. At 2:14 p.m. I heard Eric's voice in the hallway, talking to someone from the venue staff. Low, unhurried, completely steady. At 2:28 p.m. he knocked. I said, "Come in." He came in. He was wearing a dark suit I had never seen before. His hair was silver and neatly combed. He was 67 years old, and he looked exactly like someone who had driven 2.5 hours that morning without mentioning it to anyone. He looked at me for a moment. He said, "There she is." I said, "Hi, Eric." He said, "You ready?" I said, "Yes." He offered his arm. I reached into my coat, took the brass key from the pocket, and held it in my closed right hand. I said, "I'm ready." He nodded once. We walked to the doors together. I heard them before I felt the change in the air. The old timber hinges, the particular low groan of cedar on cedar, and then the light shifted and the sound of the gathered guests came through all at once, the rustling and the low murmur going suddenly quiet as people turned. Eric walked at my pace. Unhurried. His arm was steady under my hand. I looked straight ahead, toward Matthias, who was standing at the end of the aisle with his hands clasped in front of him, and his face entirely open in the way it only was when he was feeling something he hadn't prepared for. His eyes went bright. He pressed his lips together once and then let them relax. I walked toward him. The aisle was not long. Maybe 40 feet of pine flooring between the doors and the place where Matthias stood. But I felt every foot of it with the particular clarity of something you are going to remember precisely, not as an impression but as a series of exact images. The light from the clear-story windows falling in long pale bars across the floor, the smell of cedar and the faint brine from the harbor below, the faces of people I knew and loved turning toward me one by one. And I felt the moment the guests nearest to the back registered who was walking with me. It moved through the room like a tide going out. The slight collective shift, the intake, the turning of heads. I didn't look for it. I was watching Matthias. But I felt it, the way you feel a change in pressure without seeing the weather that caused it. I kept walking. I was aware, in my peripheral vision, of the back rows. I knew where my father was sitting. I had seen him escorted to his seat from a distance, through the gap in the anteroom door, at 2:41 p.m. He was in the third row on the left side. Family side. I did not look at him. I reached Matthias. He took both my hands. He looked at me for a long moment with his face completely open, and then he smiled. Not a wide smile, just the particular one that meant he was certain, and that was exactly right. Then he looked at Eric and gave a single, serious nod, and Eric returned it, and then Eric stepped back and took his seat in the front row on the right, next to Gunnar and Sonia. Paula began the ceremony. I will not try to render the ceremony in full. Some things are not meant to be narrated, and this is one of them. Not because it was private in a way that excludes the telling, but because the words that Matthias and I said to each other in that hall belong to a register that doesn't survive transcription. They were the right words. That is what I can say. What I can say about the room. The light from the clear-story windows had gone from pale gold to something warmer as the afternoon deepened, and it fell across Matthias's face in a way that made him look exactly like himself. Which sounds like nothing but is in fact the hardest thing to find in a person, the quality of being entirely and recognizably present. His hands were warm around mine. He didn't let go. What I can say about the guests. The room was very quiet in the way that large rooms full of people go quiet when everyone is paying attention to the same thing and they all know it. Gunnar had his hands folded in his lap and his eyes were very bright. Sonia touched his arm once. I didn't look toward the left side of the aisle. I didn't need to. Paula said what needed to be said, and Matthias said his words, and I said mine, and it was all exactly as it should be, which is the best thing a ceremony can be. What I will say is that when Matthias slid the ring onto my finger, his grandfather's ring, the one that came over from Norway in 1952 with a man who had $17 and a set of hand tools and the particular stubbornness of someone who has decided to build something and will, I felt the brass key in my closed right hand and understood for the first time clearly what I was going to do with it. I had not planned it. Or I had planned it without knowing I was planning it, the way you solve a structural problem in the back of your mind for days before the answer arrives cleanly on a Tuesday morning. The solution had been there the whole time. I just hadn't looked at it directly yet. I held the key through the recessional, walking back up the aisle with Matthias's hand in mine. I held it through the photographs on the dock in the pale November light. Matthias and me at the dock railing, then with Gunnar and Sonia, then with Eric, who stood beside me with one hand in his jacket pocket and an expression that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. The photographer was a woman named Claire who worked with the quiet focus of someone who understood that the important things were not always the posed ones. She caught me looking at Matthias during the photographs, not at the camera, and I knew before she said anything that the image would be the one worth keeping. I held the key through the first part of the reception where people found their seats and the caterers moved between tables and the harbor glittered flat and silver below us. Matthias's colleague from Tacoma found me at the drink station and we talked for 20 minutes about the Bremerton Dock project. The permit delays, the substrate issues, the way a project can go sideways not from one large failure but from the accumulation of small ones. He said, "You look like you're doing all right." I said, "I am." He nodded and accepted that and moved on, which was the right thing to do. The light in the boathouse shifted as the afternoon wore on, moving from the flat gray-white of November noon to something warmer at the edges, amber-tinged, the kind of light that comes when the clouds thin a little and the sun that you couldn't see makes itself known anyway through the quality of what reaches the ground. Sonia caught my eye from across the room at one point and gave me a small nod that meant something I didn't need to translate. I nodded back. A woman named Petra, who had been Matthias's colleague in the early years and now ran her own marine fabrication shop in Bellingham, found me near the drinks table and shook my hand the way she always shook hands. Fully, without the softening some people applied when they weren't sure if you wanted it. She said, "You chose well." I said, "In what sense?" She said, "All of them." She took her drink and went back to her table. I liked her very much. My father was at the family table. My mother was beside him. Britta and Cole were there too. She had not left. I had not expected her to, ultimately. Leaving would have required a different kind of nerve than she had. Cole looked the way he always looked at family events. Attentive, careful, doing his best to take up the minimum amount of space while still being present. He was not a bad man. He had married someone complicated and was still, as far as I could tell, trying. I let the reception settle. I let people eat. I ate most of my dinner and drank half a glass of wine and watched the room and waited until the moment felt right. Not for a dramatic effect. For my own clarity, I wanted to be sure of what I was going to say before I sat down. I had been carrying the brass key in my closed right hand since before the doors opened, and by the time the reception was an hour deep, the metal was as warm as my own skin, so that I had to look at my hand to remember it was there. At 5:48 p.m., I walked to the family table. My father looked up when I arrived. My mother did too. Britta's eyes came to me and then moved sideways, the particular way she looked at things she didn't want to look at directly. I pulled a chair from the adjacent table and set it at the corner between my father and my mother, facing them both. I sat down. Cole was at the far end of the table and gave me a careful nod. I nodded back. I said, "I want to talk for a few minutes, if that's okay." My mother said, "Of course." My father said, "Sure." He was holding his wine glass with both hands and he looked like he had been holding it that way for a while. I said, "First, I'm glad you're here. Both of you. I mean that." My mother said, "We wouldn't have missed it." I said, "I know." My father said, "Ingrid." I said, "Let me finish, Dad. Then you can say what you want." He closed his mouth. He nodded once. I said, 3 days ago you called and told me you weren't walking me down the aisle. You said it wasn't a big deal. That lots of women walk alone." I looked at him. "I want to tell you what I heard when you said that." I heard that keeping Britta comfortable was more important than honoring what you'd committed to me. I heard that the cost of that decision was mine to carry, not yours. And I heard that you thought I would accept that quietly. My mother said, that isn't. I said, I'm still talking, Mom. She went still. I said, I did accept it quietly. I didn't argue. I didn't call back and make it a scene. I made a different arrangement and it worked, and I'm glad it did. Eric was exactly the right person to walk with me today, and I'll be grateful for that for the rest of my life. My father said, quietly, I know I handled it wrong. I said, I know you do. I paused. What I want to say is this, it wasn't one phone call. The phone call was just the day the accounting became visible. My father looked at me. He put his wine glass down very carefully. I said, 2 winters ago, I transferred $22,000 to your account when the municipal contract fell through. I didn't make it a conversation. You thanked me once at Christmas and we moved on. That was fine. That's how we operate. My father said, Ingrid, that was. I said, I'm not finished. He closed his mouth. I said, the same winter I co-signed Britta's bridge loan. $18,500. If they had defaulted, that was my liability. She didn't thank me. I glanced at Britta. That's fine too. I'm not listing this for thanks. Britta said, then why are you listing it? I looked at her. I said, because 3 days ago, when you told Dad that watching him walk me down the aisle would be hard for you, and he called and withdrew, the message was that what I've given this family doesn't change what I'm owed. Or rather, it confirmed that I'm not owed anything at all. That my comfort, my day, my one formal request comes last. Britta said, that's not what. I said, I'm not finished. She pressed her lips together. I said, the spring after the contract, I drove up and cooked and cleaned for 2 weeks when Mom had her procedure. I did the structural drawings for your porch permit, pro bono, with my professional seal. I spent 3 evenings on Dad's subcontractor dispute so it wouldn't go to litigation. I sourced the ramp materials for the boat shed at cost and installed it on a Saturday morning. I looked at my father. I did all of it because this is my family and that's what you do for family. I wasn't keeping score. My father said very quietly, I know that. I said, but I'm keeping score now. Not because I want to. Because you made it necessary. The table was very quiet. My mother said softly, Ingrid. We know what you've given. I said, do you? She didn't answer. I said, 3 days before my wedding you called and told me to walk alone. Mom called after and said the same thing. Britta had a feeling. That feeling outweighed everything. I let that sit for a moment. I need you to understand what that told me. Not about the wedding. About the structure of this family and where I am in it. My father put his wine glass down. He said, you've never been at the bottom of anything, Ingrid. You know that isn't how we. I said, then why was it easy to call me? He didn't answer. I said, why wasn't it easy to call Britta? Silence. I said, I think you called me because you knew I would handle it. I think you knew I wouldn't make it terrible. I think you've always known that, and I think somewhere along the way that became permission to ask me to absorb things that cost more than they should. My father's face had gone very still. He said, that's not fair. I said, maybe not. But it's what I have. He said, you're doing this on your wedding day. I said, you made the choices on my wedding day. I'm just finishing the conversation. My mother said, quietly, your father has been carrying this since the call. You know that, right? I looked at her. I said, I know he has. I paused. That's not the same thing as it being right. She said, no. She said it carefully, the way she said things when she was agreeing without wanting to be heard agreeing. She looked at her hands. You could have come to us. You could have called and said this isn't acceptable. I said I did call. That's what the card was. That's what the call 2 days later was when he said yes. She said I meant afterward. When he changed his mind. You could have pushed back. I said I did. I said I understand. And then I called someone who showed up. My father said, Ingrid. I said, Dad. She was asking why I didn't fight harder. I'm telling you, I've been fighting for this family's attention for years, and I got very good at doing it quietly. Quietly is not the same as not fighting. His jaw tightened. He said, I know you've given a lot. I know that. I never meant for you to feel. I said, what did you mean for me to feel? He didn't answer right away. He looked at the key, still sitting on the table in front of him. He hadn't touched it. He said, I made the call because I thought you could handle it. You always handle things. I said, that's not an excuse. It's a description of a pattern. He said, I know. I said, the pattern is the problem, not the call. He was quiet for a long moment. The harbor outside had gone dark in the windows. The candles at the tables around us had burned lower. He said, I'm not. He stopped. He tried again. I want you to know that the call wasn't easy. I want you to know that. I said, I believe you. He said, your sister has been. He stopped again. The past 2 years have been very hard for her. For Cole and her both. And she came to us and she was struggling. And I looked at you and I thought, Ingrid will be fine. Ingrid is always fine. I said, I know that's what you thought. He said, that wasn't meant to be a dismissal. It was meant to be. I said, I know what it was meant to be. I kept my voice even. You looked at 2 daughters and you decided one of them needed protecting and the other one didn't. And you were right that I didn't need the same kind of protection Britta needed. I paused. But that isn't the same thing as not needing anything at all. He said nothing. I said, I needed you to keep the promise you made. That's a small thing. That's the smallest version of what I've been. He looked at his hands. He said quietly, I didn't know how to tell Britta no. I said, I know. He said, she was all ready. I said, I know. I looked at him steadily. And I'm telling you now, as plainly as I know how to, the next time there is something that costs you something to give to me, I need you to find a way to give it. Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. My mother's hands were still on the table. She said softly, he knows that. I said, I know he knows it. I want him to hear it said. My father looked up. His jaw was tight. He said, I hear it. I said, good. He was quiet. His hand moved toward the key again and stopped. Britta said, you've always done this. You've always made everything about how much more you are than the rest of us. How much more capable, how much more composed, how much more. I looked at her. I said, you told me that this morning. That I make you feel like less without trying. She said, yes. I said, I heard you. And I'm telling you now, I'm not responsible for what my competence does to your self-image. That belongs to you. She said, that's such a cold thing to say. I said, it's a true thing. She said, it's both. I said, I know. She said, you always know. That's the problem. You always know the right thing and the fair thing and the honest thing and you say it and it lands and then you look at us like we should be grateful that you pointed it out. Like you're doing us a favor by being right. I said, I'm not trying to be right. She said, but you are. You're always right, Ingrid. Every time. And it's exhausting. The table was quiet for a moment. I said, I hear you. And I'm going to say something that I mean and that I also need you to hear. I'm not going to be less of what I am to make this family more comfortable. I've tried that. It doesn't work and it isn't honest. She said, I'm not asking you to be less. I said, you kind of are. She pressed her lips together. She didn't say anything. My father said, Ingrid, what do you want from us? What is this meant to accomplish? I reached into my closed right hand. I had been holding the brass key through the whole conversation, warm from my palm, the cork square compressed against my fingers. I set it on the table in front of my father. He looked at it. His face changed. I slid it across the table toward him slowly. He watched it move. When it stopped in front of him, he looked up at me, and the color was gone from his face the way it goes when something arrives that you can't arrange a response to. He said, where did you? I said, you gave it to me when I was 12. You said every person who operated a vessel needed to be responsible for her own key. You said losing it was not an option. He didn't say anything. I said, I kept it for 22 years. I looked at him. I'm giving it back. My mother made a small sound. Not a word. I said I don't want to be estranged. I don't want to stop being your daughter or stop being part of this family. I want to keep coming to dinners and I want to keep helping when help is needed and I want us to find a way to be honest about what this family actually is instead of what we agree to pretend it is. My father said nothing. His hand moved toward the key and stopped just short of it. I said, you told me that keeping Britta comfortable was more important than what you'd committed to me. I am telling you now that I needed more from you than that. I needed you to hold the line. I met his eyes. Hold the line next time. He said, Ingrid. I said, that's all I have. I stood. I smoothed my dress. I said, I'm glad you came. I'm glad you were both here today. I looked at Britta. I'm glad you stayed. Then I said, enjoy the rest of the evening. I said it quietly, without weight, and I meant it without irony. I walked back toward Matthias. I didn't look back. He was standing near the windows that faced the harbor, talking to Gunnar, and he turned when he saw me coming and finished the sentence he was in the middle of before he gave his attention fully to me. That was a thing I noticed about him, early in our relationship. He finished things. He didn't drop what he was holding to chase after what came next. He made room for what came next, and then it came. He said, how do you feel? I said, I feel clear. He said, good. He took my hand. We stood at the window for a moment and looked at the harbor. The water was very dark and the dock lights made a long pale line across the surface, shifting with the movement of the tide. He said, Gunnar wants to toast us before people leave. He said it quietly, not making a thing of it. I said, yes. Good. The toast was brief and warm and slightly incoherent in the way of toasts given by people who have a great deal to say and know that the moment is not for saying all of it. Gunnar said something about boats. He said something about what it meant to him to see his son standing at the end of that aisle. He said, you both know where the deep water is and you know how to read it. He lifted his glass. We lifted ours. The room was full of people I was glad to have there. I looked at the faces and thought, yes. This is the right shape of a day. The reception wound down the way good receptions do. Not with a sharp ending but with a slow, comfortable diminishment, the crowd thinning by ones and twos, the music going quieter, the harbor outside going dark and still. At 8:30 p.m., Matthias and I stood on the dock behind the boathouse. The other guests were mostly inside. The air was cold and smelled of salt and diesel from a vessel moving somewhere out in the dark. I could see the running lights, orange-white, small against the black water. Matthias said, how are you? I said, I'm all right. He said, the table conversation. I said, you saw. He said, I didn't hear. But I saw. I said, I'll tell you all of it later. Not tonight. He said, okay. He put his arm around me. We stood on the dock and watched the running lights until they disappeared around the point. The dark beyond the harbor mouth was complete and still. The water held only its own weight. The boards of the dock were cold through my shoes. I stood in it and felt my own breathing slow and even out. The coat smelled like cedar from the boathouse. The brass key was no longer in my pocket and that was fine. Eric found us at 8:47 p.m. He came out the side door of the boathouse with his coat on and his hands in his pockets and said he was heading out. He had a long drive. I said, you don't have to go. He said, it's a good time to go. You two have a party to finish. I said, Eric. I didn't have anything to add to that. Just his name. He looked at me. He said, your dad called me, you know. This afternoon. After the ceremony. I said, what did he say? He said it was good to see me. A pause. That's all he said. It's more than he's said in 3 years, so? I said, I'm sorry about all of it. He said, don't be. You did good today. I said, I don't know if I did. He said, you did what needed doing. That's the same thing. He hugged me once, briefly, the way he always hugged, complete and without ceremony. Then he shook Matthias's hand and walked back along the dock toward the parking area and didn't look back. His footsteps on the dock boards were unhurried, even, and then they went quiet, and then there was only the water. I watched until the dark had taken him completely. The harbor was very still. Somewhere out past the breakwater a bell buoy was ringing. 3 beats and a pause, 3 beats and a pause, the kind of sound that goes on whether anyone hears it or not. Matthias said he drove down for my dad's retirement party too. 3 years ago. He didn't know my dad well. But he came. I said, that's Eric. He said, yes. I said, my father and he haven't spoken much in the past few years. Something that happened a long time ago, before I understood enough of the family to know what it was. I looked at the water. He called tonight. After the ceremony. To say it was good to see him. Matthias said, that's a beginning. I said, it might be. I don't know what it is yet. He said, that's all right. I said, yes. It is. My parents left at 9:12 p.m. My mother hugged me for a long time and didn't say much. My father hugged me too, shorter, and when he pulled back he looked at me for a moment with an expression I didn't have a name for. Not quite an apology, not quite an acknowledgement, but something between the two that I thought might, eventually, become something more useful. He said, you looked beautiful today. I said, thank you, Dad. He said, we'll talk. He said it like a question that had decided to present itself as a statement. I said, yes. We will. My mother was beside him. She touched my arm and said quietly, we mean it. Both of us. Whatever I said yesterday, I want you to know that. She looked at me with the particular steadiness she saved for things she meant without negotiation. I said, I know. He nodded. He put on his coat and followed my mother out. Britta left with Cole at 9:20 p.m. She stopped beside me near the door. Cole kept walking and gave us space. She stood with her arms crossed over her chest the way she had always stood when she was deciding something. She said, I don't know what to do with what you said tonight. I said, I know. She said, I'm not going to say you were wrong. I'm not going to say that. I said, okay. She said, but I need some time. I said, take what you need. She looked at me. She said, did you mean it? That you don't want to be estranged? I said, yes. She said, even after everything. I said, even after everything. She pressed her lips together. Then she said, okay. She said it the way she'd said fine that morning in the anteroom. Not quite settled. Not quite open, but not closed either. Somewhere in between. Which was, I thought, the most honest thing she'd said to me in a long time. She left. Cole gave me a small nod at the door. The last guests left at 10:34 p.m. Matthias and I helped the venue coordinator fold the last of the linens and stack the chairs at the far wall, and then we were alone in the main hall. The timber framing above us, the harbor below, the lights of the boathouse reflected on the dark water in long pale columns that shifted and returned with the movement of the tide. Matthias sat on the edge of a table and looked at me. He said, tell me. I told him. All of it. The conversation at the table, the key, my father's face when he recognized it, the 3 exits at the door. Matthias listened the way he always listened, without filling the pauses. He waited until I was done before he said anything. When I finished, he said, the key. That was the right thing. I said, I didn't plan it. He said, the best things usually aren't planned. I said, he looked at it like I stopped. Like he'd forgotten he gave it to me. And also like he'd known all along that I'd kept it. Matthias said, both can be true. I said, yes. He said, what do you think happens next? With your dad? I said, I think he calls in a few weeks. I think it takes him time to figure out what he wants to say. I think we have a harder conversation than this one, but one with more room in it. He said, and Britta? I said, I don't know. She said she needed time. I believed her. He said, that's something. I said, it is. He said, are you glad you did it? The conversation. I thought about it. I said, yes. He said, even if nothing changes. I said, something already changed. He saw his own face when he looked at that key. I can't ungive him that. He looked at me. Whatever he does with it, whatever any of them do, they now know that I know. That's different from before. Matthias nodded. He said, and you? What do you need now? I said, to stop thinking about it for tonight. He said, then let's go. He held the door. That was exactly right. I went to my coat, draped over the chair by the door where I'd left it at the beginning of the evening. I reached into the inside pocket. The pocket was empty. The key was on a table in the reception hall somewhere, or in my father's pocket, or left behind on the family table when they cleared the settings. I didn't know. I hadn't thought about what would happen to it once I set it down. That was all right. Some things you hold for 22 years and then you set them down and you don't need to know where they go after that. The holding was the point. The setting down was the point. What came next was something else, something that didn't need a name yet. I put my coat on. Matthias held the door. We walked out onto the dock together, into the cold salt air, into the particular quiet of a harbor at night, when the last ferry has already run and the running lights are gone and the water holds the sky's reflection without comment. I didn't look back at the boathouse. I looked at the water, and the water was dark and still, and the bell buoy out past the breakwater was still ringing. 3 beats and a pause, 3 beats and a pause, and the cold came off the water with the particular cleanness of November, and I stood in it and let it do its work. Matthias put his arm around me. I leaned into him. The dock moved very slightly under us, the way docks do when the tide is changing. Not dramatically, just enough to remind you that the ground you're standing on is not fixed, that it rises and falls with something larger than itself, and that this is not a flaw in the ground but simply its nature. I thought, I know where I am. I know what the ground does here. I have the chart. That's enough to navigate by. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who's carried something quietly for too long.